Hello everyone, let's talk about No Man Knows My History, chapter 16. What should we say? I think we should start off by talking about how I feel like the Danites are a gang. And one of the things that made me write that comment in my notes was that they have signals, that these people are trying to vote. It says that the Mormons were excited to begin voting after years of not doing so. I guess maybe getting their settlement together and not starving to death was more important than once they got that figured out, they decided they wanted to start voting, and they're getting persecution and violence against them from the old settlers who have beef with them and do not want them to have the right to vote. And America, of course, has a long history of trying to deny the citizens of that country of their constitutional right to vote. And the Mormons were victims of this persecution as well. So the Danites have a signal. It says when they did get into scraps with the settlers, they would throw up a signal for assistance, and then the people would come and bail them out. And it says by the end of these squabbles, there were people bruised and hurt, but no one died, and the Mormons were able to finally secure their vote. I think that violence should not usually be the first thing that we turn to in society when trying to right injustices, but in the case of this, I see no problem with it in the sense that there wasn't any moral justification to keep Mormons from voting. It was just because they were scared of the Mormons voting as a voting bloc and commanding the electoral process. So I think the Mormons were absolutely right to defend themselves and their right to vote, and it had to come to physical blows, which is unfortunate, but the fight for equitable voting rights continues on well into the 2020s, if you can believe it. There are still people in the 2020 major election of November. There were still millions of people who lacked consistent, solid access to voting. And there's proof that people who live in more affluent areas have an easier access to voting booths with better stocked resources and things like that. So people who are poor are disproportionately affected, and it's hard for them to vote. So Mormons, I think, had every right to defend themselves and get their right to vote. I think there's the guy that gives the quote, "Hey, my grandparents fought in the Revolutionary War against the British, and we are just as much inheritors of these constitutional rights as anyone else." And so I think that's fair. That's a really good argument. I think overall the narrative of the brutal violence between the Mormons and the Missouri settlers during this period of Mormon history is really despicable, and I think both sides come out looking really terrible. The settlers really had no genuine reason to be upset with the Mormons other than their concerns about them taking over and becoming too powerful of a voting bloc. And they were worried about Mormon Northerners being abolitionists. But other than that, I mean, they were just scared. And so they allowed themselves to be whipped up into a frenzy about this fear that was largely unfounded and committed really horrible atrocities. And in response, instead of being Christian and tempering themselves, the Mormon leaders decided to give in to their worst instincts for violence and retribution. And it's really easy to do that if you have God on your side. If you believe that you are justified in God, then you are capable of extending your breadth of moral decision making to lengths that normal people would not normally consider acceptable. These people are suffering. The innocent Mormon people who are believers of Joseph Smith, they believe in the church structure and hierarchy, they believe that it's blessed their life, even through the sacrifice and martyrdom. These people are suffering. They are malnourished, they're cold, they don't have well-fitting clothes, and they're having a really hard time. And it's so frustrating because the whole time you think about this, and the famous quote from Liberty Jail of Joseph Smith getting angry with God and feeling like he's been forsaken, of course, will come in the next chapter. But we're getting a preamble to this here of if God really is over the saints, if the creator and caretaker of the universe is the steward of the cosmos and Joseph Smith is his mouthpiece, it is absolutely understandable why Joseph Smith is drawn to this level of desperation, where he basically feels as though the saints have been completely forgotten because they are in such meager circumstances and they are facing so much persecution, and the people are being whipped and beaten in public. They're being humiliated. Their homes and their places of worship and places of industry are being burned to the ground. So they're really suffering. And to make matters worse, the government is still not interceding on their behalf. This is where at this point you kind of see the villain origin story. Up to this point, the government has been really crappy in their treatment of the Mormons. They have not come to their defense. They have not defended their religious liberty. They've made it very difficult for the Mormons. And at this point, the Mormons decide, you know what, if the law is not going to help us, then so be it. We will go against the law. And they try to get Governor Boggs to help them. And I think it's very telling. Fawn Brodie makes it clear that Boggs had never lifted a finger to stop the 5-year-long depredations of the Old Settlers against the Mormons, but the news of the Mormons getting their militias up galvanized him into action. That's a really good point, is that where was, it's like in Lord of the Rings, where was Gondor? Where was Boggs when the Mormons were being treated unfairly? If you'll remember, he didn't want to get involved because it was impracticable. But now that the Mormons are seen retaliating and getting their militia together to defend themselves against what they perceive as unjust persecution, they reach out to the government and they're not willing to help. But then the government is willing to send a militia to stop the Mormons from gathering. So obviously you can see this is the last straw for Joseph Smith and Lyman White and Sidney Rigdon and these Mormon leaders. They are fed up. They're saying, if you're not going to help us, we will take matters into our own hands. And they take it one step further with this really toxic masculinity ideology of, God is going to be on our side, and we will either spread the word of God via peace or the sword. And it seems like peace isn't working. So this marks a huge turning point, I think, in the Mormon thought process of these leaders who have decided that if God is truly on our side and we are putting ourselves up against a serious threat, then God would want nothing more for us than to hammer our enemies into submission. So the latest reply of Boggs to our petitions, Joseph says, is to tell us to fight our own battles. And that, brethren, is exactly what we intend to do. Again, I can appreciate someone being willing to stand up for their people and say, we refuse to be marginalized and we refuse to be the victims of this political harassment, and that's all well and good. But there's obviously some things in this chapter that make very clear that there are some really despicable, evil people on both sides of this conflict. It's not a clear example, and it almost never is, of an oppressive, villainous force overcoming a submissive, pacifistic, morally upright people. There are absolutely heroes and villains on both sides of this very laughably stupid conflict. There's no reason for this conflict to have to take place in the first place. The settlers were obviously driven by blind hatred towards a religion they didn't understand, which is something that is still rampant in today's political scheme of the villainization of other people's religion. I fell victim to that mindset when I first left the Mormon church because I started reading the works of Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, these so-called new atheists in the modern atheist movement, and they have pretty negative things to say about religion. But the problem with that is a lot of people get caught up in hearing bad things about another person's doctrine or beliefs or practices, and then they'll use that to justify racism, xenophobia, and every other bad thing. And so this exact same kind of prejudice is being brought up against the Mormons. I don't mean to give the Mormons a huge full pass. As we know, in Kirtland, many people in Ohio knew about the accusations of polygamy and the moral and virtue failings of the Mormons there, and so obviously there were things that were shady and not good that the Mormons do deserve to be held accountable for. But it seems like in the case of Missouri, these people aren't so much interested in that and are really just driven by hatred of another people who they don't want to be neighbors with. So these people, again, the Sidney Rigdon and Lyman White and Joseph Smith are getting to the point where they're so fed up and so filled with rage that they're ready to start committing friendly fire against anyone who isn't fully on board with their plan to retaliate with violence. Rigdon says, "The blood of the backward be spilled in the streets of Far West," and Joseph says, "I make a better resolution. If they give us any more grief, we will put them on the front line and make them charge with bayonets." And so there's this kind of banter going around, even to the point where, I think it's Sidney Rigdon, where they're at the village, and he says, "The last person who has left with no consequences was today. Anyone else who tries to leave our colony now will be shot and killed." So the Mormons are hardcore. I think their villain origin story is complete, and they are... they have been beaten down so much by the injustices they've faced that they have become the people who will yet inflict injustice upon others, which is tragedy. Of course, none of this has to happen. Joseph Smith says, "If the people will let us alone, we will preach the gospel in peace. But if they come on us to molest us, we will establish our religion by the sword." He goes on, "We will trample down our enemies and make it one gore of blood from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean." That is extremely violent rhetoric, and I think it goes to show, I mentioned there was a very similar quote from the last chapter. If people will just leave us alone, then we'll preach the gospel in peace. That's such a double standard. It's so hypocritical. Oh, if you leave us alone and don't persecute us, don't challenge us, don't hold us accountable for any of the things that are wrong in our community, if you just stay silent about everything that we're doing wrong, then all we will do in return is send our missionaries to come bother you in public when you'd rather be spending your time with your families or at work or whatever. Mormon missionaries are not known for having super strong boundaries, and I was a pretty eager missionary myself, so I know what I'm talking about. So Joseph says, if you leave us alone, all we'll do is preach the gospel in peace, which I think is an oxymoron. That statement makes no sense from someone of my disposition. And he says, but if they come on us to molest us, we will establish our religion by the sword. So, and it says, the Al-Quran, the Quran, or the sword. So shall it eventually be with us, Joseph Smith or the sword. This is a powerful quote from Joseph Smith, and it really betrays the level of arrogance and self-importance that he's come to identify with himself at this point in his journey. If he was humble and a poor little farm boy trying to follow the will of God in his youth and translating the Book of Mormon, he has lost all sense of that now because he is determined to take over the world. Excuse me. I had to sneeze. So I think this is an extremely important turning point in the life and leadership of Joseph Smith, who is now determined, even as we've talked about in previous commentaries, Joseph Smith, it's not quite clear the extent to which that Joseph Smith believed he was a genuine prophet, if he was a complete fraud who the entire time knew that what he was doing was fake. There's some conflation of these different things. It's not like one solid answer to that question. But what is clear is that this is a person who feels deeply responsible for the violence being incited against his people because they're committing that violence in his name, or as a result of his name, I suppose. And he is determined to fight back, and not only fight back to defend themselves, but to extend their reign and build the kingdom of God through imperialism. So, one of the things that's important to mention is the extent to which so much of this conflict came about due to gossip and rumors that were far exaggerated. It was like a really deadly game of telephone in which every eyewitness event was told to someone who had not experienced that event in 4 or 5 or 10 times worse than what the event actually was. And as that word travels around, suddenly what becomes a standoff and a pretty normal skirmish between two battling sides becomes an unholy, war crime-ridden massacre, against the settlers. And these letters are written to Governor Boggs claiming that these Mormons have savagely massacred these settlers, when that is not a true recording of those events. And so much of this conflict is exacerbated in a really horrible way. And I suppose a lot of war and conflict is like this, and it takes a cool, rational head to take a step back and say, okay, is there a way that we can proceed without violence? In the Hamilton musical, it's when they're having their conversation about maybe doing a duel, they say, "Are we doing this?" Yeah, so I guess that we're doing this. And they try to mediate, but in that case, and in this case as well, violence overcame the mood of violence was the mood of the day, right? I think it's so interesting that Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith have these like different leadership styles, where Joseph is wrestling with his men. He's got the morale high, and people are in high spirits. They're just guys having a fun time in the barracks, in between fights. And Sidney Rigdon comes down and slams the book on the table, says, today's the Sabbath, and if you guys keep desecrating it, then you will be cursed. And Joseph Smith kind of gets the guys out of trouble. I think that's what makes Joseph so endearing, is that I think people always felt like, even though he was the prophet, that he was always, representative of the the lowest common denominator. And so Joseph Smith kind of has the best of both worlds, because he gets to have the power and prestige of the biggest religious leaders and political leaders in the country's history, but he also was able to maintain this congenial reputation amongst the average member of the church. And so Sidney Rigdon was never able to capitalize on that. As I was thinking about the difference between those two, on my mission, I was so much more like Sidney Rigdon. I was so uptight. I totally had a stick up my butt. I was very uptight about all the rules, and I had several companions that were more like Joseph Smith, that were charismatic, had a way with words, understood that human beings are not meant to be perfect and reverent at all hours of the day. And so I really wish I could have been more like less like Sidney Rigdon, more like Joseph Smith in that sense. But I think anyone who served his mission has known both types of missionaries, the sticklers and the more relaxed people. I think I was reminded, going back to the rumors and gossip that made this conflict way more exacerbated than it needed to be. The letter that gets sent to Governor Boggs, saying that the Mormons had committed a massacre, is a complete fabrication. And it reminds me of Iago from Shakespeare's Othello. I say Othello because I'm an opera singer, and in Verdi's opera Othello, I guess in English we say Othello, but I'm used to saying Othello. At any rate, Iago, of course, whispers into the ears of his leader Othello and is able to convince him of his innocent wife's infidelity. And Othello, of course, tragically kills his wife Desdemona because he's been led to believe something that is not true. So there's a lot of deception happening. These people are firebrand, bloodthirsty warhawks that want to exterminate the Mormons. And if the best way for them to do that is to lie to the government and get them to believe that the Mormons are committing massacres on an unprecedented scale, then that's what they'll do. And I think that's really lame, and it just shows kind of the depravity of the men, the settlers against the Mormons. Of course, the massacre at Haun's Mill is yet another really horrible example of the senseless violence against these innocent people. There were a lot of problems in Mormon society, and obviously I think it's good for people to try to call those things out and hold people accountable and make change within a group, but massacring innocent people, women and children at point blank range with other people watching, and also there was almost certainly rampant sexual assault and horrible other crimes that are just as violent emotionally and physically. This trauma that they inflicted on people. And there were people that survived Haun's Mill and grew up. There were children there that survived and grew up to tell the tale. That is not how we should treat human people. And it's really, no one should ever laugh at the Mormons. There's a lot of things to make fun of Mormons for, but things like Haun's Mill and the battles between the Missouri militia and the Danites, it's really bad, and it's bad on both sides because the Danites are theocratic. They are evil. They are people that want to establish religion by the sword, including Joseph Smith, who you can apologize for him in the sense that perhaps he was caught up in the fever of the moment. Nevertheless, he was the leader of the people, did nothing to stop their violent hatred and trying to retaliate against the settlers fighting against them, and even stirred them up to higher levels of anger. So I think it's very interesting that I wrote a note and I'm trying to remember because my note wasn't very clear. Give me 1 second to think about it. Yeah, I don't know. I think ultimately what I want to say about this fight is my sense of frustration on behalf of Mormons that God seems to be like, where is God? If the church is supposed to be restored through Joseph Smith, if Adam on Diamond, if they found an altar in which Jesus in which Adam and Eve prayed to Jesus and Heavenly Father, they found the literal altar. Joseph and all the people are inspired of God. Hi, buddy. My dog just came in to say hi. And it's okay. All these things are happening, and they're still losing. They're taking huge L's, and that is really, really frustrating for them. I'm frustrated for them because of God not being there when they needed him most. So, I think the treaty that the Mormons are forced to sign, not the treaty, but the terms of their surrender, where they have to, all the leaders have to be surrendered to be tried for treason. All their property would be confiscated. All the Mormons would immediately have to migrate out from the state, and they would have to surrender all their arms. This reminds me of the Treaty of Versailles in World War I, where at the end of the war, the Germans were made to accept full accountability for all of the armed conflict. They were given extreme punitive measures meant to not only recoup financial losses from those combatants against the Germans, but more importantly to demoralize and humiliate them. And of course, it was that seed of hatred and resentment that would end up leading to the rise of the conflicts that would engulf the world in World War II. So I see a lot of the same things with the Mormons, that they've been brought to heel. They finally, even with God giving one angel for every Danite willing to stand and fight, that still wasn't enough. God wasn't able to muster enough troops for his loyal saints, and they surrender, they give the white flag, and they are humiliated by these really punitive terms of surrender. So that's about that. The next chapter is going to talk about Liberty Jail and the injustices that Joseph and company felt as they were on the doorstep of their own execution, and we'll see if they make it out. See ya.